At a few minutes past 9 in the morning, the sky over Halifax Harbour turned white, then nothing at all. Moments earlier, two ships sat tangled together in the narrowest part of the channel, one of them burning. Smoke climbed in a thick black column, and on the docks and in the windows of the houses above the water, people stopped to watch. Office workers leaned out over their desks. Schoolchildren pressed against classroom glass. Sailors lined the rails of nearby vessels, pointing at the flames and waiting to see what would happen next. None of them knew what was inside the burning ship. She was called the Mont Blanc, a French cargo vessel, and her holds were packed with nearly 3,000 tons of high explosives, bound for the war in Europe. For 20 minutes, she drifted, ablaze, toward a crowded pier at the edge of the city, and for 20 minutes Halifax treated the fire as a spectacle instead of a warning. Then, at 4 minutes and 35 seconds past 9 o'clock, the fire reached the cargo. The blast that followed was the largest man-made explosion the world had ever seen, and it would remain the largest until the atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima nearly 28 years later. In an instant, a column of fire and smoke rose miles into the sky. A wall of pressure tore outward from the harbor at the speed of sound, flattening homes, shattering windows for miles, and erasing an entire district of the city from the map. By the time the smoke cleared, nearly 2,000 people were dead, and another 9,000 were injured. Halifax had become a disaster zone in under a tenth of a second. To understand how an ordinary harbor morning turned into one of the deadliest accidents in Canadian history, the story has to begin 3 years earlier, with a war on the other side of the Atlantic and a port that had become one of the most important and most overcrowded harbors in the world. By December of 1917, the First World War had been grinding on for more than 3 years, and Halifax, Nova Scotia, had become one of its critical arteries. The city sat on a deep, ice-free harbor on Canada's east coast, the closest major port to Europe on the entire continent. Troops, weapons, food, and fuel destined for the Western Front passed through it constantly, gathered into convoys before making the dangerous crossing of the U-boat-infested Atlantic. The harbor itself was shaped almost perfectly for this purpose. A wide outer basin near the open sea narrowed into a slender passage called the Narrows, barely a few hundred meters across at its tightest point, before opening again into Bedford Basin, a broad anchorage where dozens of ships could gather and wait for their escorts. That bottleneck, so useful for funneling wartime traffic, would also make the coming disaster far worse than it needed to be. On the morning of December 6th, two ships were converging on the Narrows from opposite directions. Inbound from the sea came the Mont Blanc, a French steamer under the command of Captain Aimé Le Médec, guided by a harbor pilot named Francis Mackey. She had spent the previous night anchored outside the harbor, waiting for the protective submarine nets at the entrance to open. Unknown to almost everyone in Halifax, her holds were loaded with TNT, picric acid, and gun cotton, while barrels of highly flammable benzol fuel were lashed to her open deck. By convention, a ship carrying that kind of cargo flew a red warning flag. The Mont Blanc did not. Outbound from Bedford Basin, heading the other way, came the Emo, a Norwegian steamship chartered to carry relief supplies to Belgium. She was running behind schedule and moving faster than the harbor's rules allowed. Two ships, one narrow channel, and neither one willing to fully give way. The rules for passing through the Narrows were simple. Ships moving in opposite directions were supposed to keep to their own side of the channel, passing each other safely on the right. On the morning of December 6th, those rules broke down in a matter of minutes. The Emo had already drifted out of her proper lane once that morning, after swinging wide to avoid a stationary ship near the harbor mouth, and she never fully corrected course. As she approached the Narrows, she found herself on the wrong side of the channel, bearing down directly into the path of the incoming Mont Blanc. The two ships sounded their whistles at each other, each one signaling that it intended to hold its course and expected the other to yield. Neither captain wanted to take responsibility for backing down, and by the time both crews realized a collision was unavoidable, there was no longer room or time to fully avoid it. Pilot Mackey ordered the Mont Blanc hard over in a final attempt to slip past, but the move only turned her hull directly into the Emo's bow. The two ships came together at low speed, almost gently by the standards of a ship collision. The Emo's bow sliced into the Mont Blanc's forward hold, then scraped free as the engines reversed. It should have been a minor, forgettable accident. But the impact had knocked over the benzol barrels stacked on the Mont Blanc's deck, and metal grinding against metal had thrown sparks. The spilled fuel ignited almost immediately, and flames began climbing toward the holds packed with high explosives below. Captain Lemaitre understood exactly what that fire meant. He ordered his crew to abandon ship rather than risk staying aboard to fight it, and the Mont Blanc, ablaze and unmanned, began drifting on the tide directly toward the piers of Halifax's north end. As the burning ship drifted closer to shore, the fire aboard her grew louder and brighter, and Halifax came out to watch. It was a school morning and a workday, and the harbor was the heart of the city's daily life. People leaned out of office windows along the waterfront. Crews on nearby ships gathered at the rails. In the working-class neighborhood of Richmond, perched on the slope above Pier 6 where the Mont Blanc was now heading, families and schoolchildren pressed against their windows to get a better look at the spectacle in the harbor below. Almost no one understood the danger. Word that the burning ship was carrying munitions had not spread beyond a handful of harbor officials and a few sailors who tried, mostly without success, to warn people away from the docks. Among those who did understand were two railway men working in a small wooden dispatch office in the Richmond rail yards, just a few hundred feet from the burning ship. Vince Coleman, a 45-year-old train dispatcher, and his colleague William Lovett had been warned by a sailor that the Mont Blanc was loaded with explosives and could detonate at any moment. Lovett fled the building immediately. Coleman started to follow him, then stopped. A passenger train, inbound from St. John with hundreds of people aboard, was due to pass directly through the danger zone within minutes. Coleman turned back into the office, sat down at his telegraph key, and began tapping out an urgent warning to every station down the line, telling them to hold all incoming trains because a munitions ship was on fire and about to explode. He stayed at his post, sending that message until the moment the ship detonated. Whether his warning was the deciding factor in stopping the train has been debated by historians ever since, but the train did stop short of the city, and Coleman's choice to remain at his post, fully aware of what was coming, has made him one of the enduring figures of that morning. At 4 minutes and 35 seconds past 9 o'clock, the fire aboard the Mont Blanc reached her cargo, and nearly 3,000 tons of high explosives detonated at once. The ship itself ceased to exist in a fraction of a second, torn apart with such force that fragments of her hull were later found miles away. A column of smoke and debris rose more than 3 miles into the sky, visible from villages dozens of miles outside the city. The shockwave raced outward from the harbor faster than sound, flattening or severely damaging buildings across more than a square mile of Halifax in an instant. In Richmond, the neighborhood overlooking the pier where crowds had gathered to watch the fire, almost nothing was left standing. Homes that had been full of families and curious onlookers a moment before were reduced to splinters and rubble. The blast also drove a wall of water out of the harbor in a small tsunami, surging onto the shores of both Halifax and Dartmouth across the channel and dragging the wrecked Emo up onto the opposite shoreline. Glass shattered for miles in every direction. Many of the people who had been watching from their windows, fascinated by the burning ship moments earlier, were blinded or maimed by flying shards as the blast wave reached them. Fires broke out across the wrecked district from overturned stoves and broken gas lines, and within minutes the ruins of Richmond were burning. In under a tenth of a second, an entire section of a major Canadian city had been destroyed, and the work of finding the living among the dead was only beginning. In the chaos immediately after the explosion, survivors began digging through the wreckage with their bare hands, searching for the trapped and the wounded before fire or collapsing rubble could reach them. Hospitals throughout the city were overwhelmed within the hour, treating patients in hallways and corridors as doctors and nurses worked without rest. Many of the injured had wounds from flying glass, and a significant number had lost their sight entirely, a wave of blindness that would shape the city's medical and social institutions for years afterward. The disaster could easily have ended there, but Halifax was not finished being tested. Less than 24 hours after the explosion, a powerful winter storm moved in off the Atlantic, dropping roughly 40 centimeters of snow on the ruined city and whipping the wreckage with gale-force winds. Rescue workers who had been searching the rubble for survivors now had to do it through blinding snow and falling temperatures, while thousands of newly homeless residents tried to find shelter in tents and damaged buildings with no heat and, in many cases, no remaining roof. The same storm that punished Halifax also delayed the help that was already on its way. Trains carrying doctors, nurses, and supplies from across Canada and the northeastern United States found their routes blocked by snow-covered tracks, forcing rescuers to dig out the rail lines before they could even reach the city. For days, Halifax existed in a strange and terrible combination of fire, ruin, and blizzard, a wartime port city trying to bury its dead while buried itself under snow. News of the explosion reached Boston by telegraph within roughly 2 hours of the blast, carried along the same rail lines that Vince Coleman had used to warn the incoming train. By late morning, the governor of Massachusetts had already wired Halifax's mayor, promising unlimited assistance, and by that evening a relief effort was underway that would become one of the largest international humanitarian responses of its kind to that point. The first medical relief train left Boston within hours, loaded with doctors, nurses, and emergency supplies, and pushed north through the same blizzard that was burying Halifax in snow. At one point, the train was brought to a complete stop by drifting snow near a mountain pass in Nova Scotia, and the men aboard spent hours shoveling the tracks clear by hand rather than wait for the storm to pass. The train finally reached Halifax on December 8th, becoming one of the first organized outside relief efforts to arrive. More trains and ships followed from Boston and from across Canada in the weeks that followed, carrying additional doctors, building supplies, and donations that would fund reconstruction for years. A relief committee organized in Massachusetts continued working in Halifax well into the 1920s, helping rebuild entire neighborhoods to safer standards. That swift response left a lasting impression on the city. More than 50 years later, Nova Scotia began an annual tradition of sending a large Christmas tree to Boston, a gift repeated every year since as a quiet thank you for a city that had reached across a border in the middle of a blizzard, within hours of hearing that strangers were in trouble. In the months that followed, Halifax buried its dead and began the slow work of rebuilding. The official death toll settled at close to 2,000, with roughly 9,000 more injured and thousands left homeless in the dead of winter. The Richmond district, once a dense neighborhood of working families along the waterfront, was rebuilt as a planned community with wider streets and sturdier construction, designed in part to prevent another disaster from spreading so quickly through tightly packed wooden homes. The wave of eye injuries caused by shattered glass left a permanent mark on Canadian medicine as well. The scale of blindness in a single city, in a single morning, pushed forward new approaches to treating eye trauma and supporting people who had lost their sight, contributing to institutions and practices that would go on to help patients far beyond Halifax. For nearly 3 decades, the Halifax explosion stood as the largest deliberate or accidental explosion ever caused by human hands, a record it held until August of 1945, when atomic weapons were used in war for the first time. Even afterward, Halifax remained the largest non-nuclear explosion in history, a distinction it holds to this day. What began as a routine wartime morning in a busy harbor, 2 ships easing past each other in a narrow channel, had become, in less than a tenth of a second, one of the deadliest accidents of the 20th century. The city that rose from the wreckage carried the scars of that morning for generations, in rebuilt streets, in institutions for the blind, and in a Christmas tree sent north each December as a reminder of the storm that buried a wounded city and the strangers who shoveled their way through it to help.